A billionaire businessman's world is turned upside down by a chance encounter that reveals a forgotten past and a family he never knew he had. This is Victor Carlisle's shocking journey to rediscover what truly matters. Before we start, be sure to subscribe for more unexpected stories and hit the like button if you're ready for a twist you won't see coming. Let's dive in. The Altmore Plaza lobby was a symphony of activity, bustling with holiday energy. High ceilings adorned with shimmering garlands reflected the glow of crystal chandeliers, and a towering Christmas tree dominated the center of the space. Its branches were laden with golden ornaments and red ribbons, each detail meticulously crafted to evoke the spirit of the season. Beneath the tree, families snapped pictures, children giggled, and couples strolled hand in hand. The air was alive with the faint sound of carols played by a string quartet tucked into a corner of the lobby. Victor Carlisle, a man whose name alone commanded respect in boardrooms around the globe, moved briskly through the crowd. He was a picture of precision, his tailored charcoal suit fitting him like a second skin, his polished leather shoes clicking against the marble floor with purposeful rhythm. His piercing gray eyes were fixed ahead, his expression unreadable but determined. Victor was a man with no patience for delays, especially today. His mind churned with thoughts of an impending merger, a deal that would further cement his legacy as one of the most influential entrepreneurs of the decade. Despite the holiday cheer swirling around him, Victor barely noticed the festive atmosphere. The conversations, the laughter, even the occasional greetings directed his way blended into the background, insignificant compared to the weight of his responsibilities. He weaved through the throng, his stride confident and unwavering, until he reached the bank of elevators at the far end of the lobby. As he waited for the elevator, his gaze flicked briefly to the colossal Christmas tree nearby. Its twinkling lights reflected in the polished marble, a kaleidoscope of red, green, and gold. It was an impressive sight, but Victor's admiration lasted only a heartbeat before his focus returned to his phone, where the latest updates on the merger awaited. "Excuse me, sir," came a small, hesitant voice from somewhere below. Victor glanced down, his expression momentarily softening in surprise. A boy, no older than 8, stood before him. The child's sandy blonde hair fell in soft waves over his forehead, and his wide blue eyes shone with a mix of determination and apprehension. He wore a simple jacket that looked a little too big for his small frame, and his sneakers were scuffed as if they'd seen countless adventures. "Yes?" Victor said, his tone brisk but not unkind. "You're in one of our family photos," the boy said earnestly, his small hand gripping the edge of Victor's coat. Victor blinked, his brows knitting together. "I'm sorry, I think you have me confused with someone else," he replied, already turning back toward the elevator. But the boy wasn't deterred. He stepped closer, his voice gaining a hint of urgency. "No, I'm sure it's you. My grandpa said so. His name was Mr. Joe Evans. He used to own a cafe, and he said you were like family to him." Victor froze. The name Joe Evans struck a distant chord in his memory, faint but undeniable. For a moment, the din of the lobby seemed to fade, replaced by the ghost of a voice, deep and warm, filled with laughter. But before Victor could fully grasp the connection, his logical side reasserted itself. He shook his head, dismissing the pang of familiarity. "I'm afraid I don't know anyone by that name," he said curtly. "Excuse me." As the elevator doors slid open, Victor stepped inside, his hand reaching out to press the button for the top floor. Before the doors closed, he caught one last glimpse of the boy. The child's expression was earnest, his gaze unwavering, as if willing Victor to remember. For a fleeting moment, Victor felt a strange tug, an inexplicable curiosity that made him hesitate. But the doors sealed shut, and the elevator began its smooth ascent, leaving the boy and his words behind. Victor shook his head, dismissing the encounter as an odd distraction. After all, he had more important matters to attend to. The elevator carried Victor to the top floor of the Altmore Tower, where his corner office commanded a panoramic view of the city. The sprawling metropolis stretched out beneath him, its twinkling lights resembling the stars scattered across a velvet sky. From this vantage point, Victor often found clarity and focus, the city below a reminder of the empire he had built through years of relentless ambition. But tonight, as the elevator doors opened with a soft chime and Victor stepped into his office, A lingering unease followed him like a shadow. He settled into his leather chair behind the expansive mahogany desk, his fingers instinctively reaching for the tablet displaying the latest reports on the merger. Numbers and projections filled the screen, a language Victor spoke fluently. Yet, as he scanned the data, the boy's voice echoed in his mind. "My grandpa said you were like family to him." Victor frowned, setting the tablet aside. He leaned back in his chair, staring out at the glittering skyline. The name Joe Evans drifted through his thoughts, elusive yet familiar. He hadn't thought about that name in years, decades even. But now, fragments of memory began to surface. Joe Evans, a kind man with a booming laugh and a weathered face that always seemed to carry a smile. Victor closed his eyes, and the faint scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries seemed to fill the air. He could almost see the old cafe where Joe had worked tirelessly behind the counter, greeting every customer as though they were an old friend. Victor sat up straighter, rubbing his temples as if to dispel the sudden wave of nostalgia. He was a man of logic, grounded in the present. There was no point in dwelling on the past, especially when he had $1 billion deal to finalize. But as the hours ticked by, the spreadsheets and emails failed to hold his attention. His mind kept returning to the boy in the lobby, his piercing blue eyes, and the conviction in his voice. "He said you were like family to him." Victor pushed away from his desk, rising to his feet. He paced the length of his office, his polished shoes sinking into the plush carpet. The memories were clearer now, a time when he had been young, struggling, and desperate for direction. Joe Evans had been more than a cafe owner. He had been a mentor, a source of unwavering kindness during a time when Victor had needed it most. The realization struck him like a jolt. How had he allowed himself to forget? And why now, after all these years, had that memory resurfaced? Victor stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing down at the city below. The faint hum of holiday carols floated up from the streets, mingling with the distant sound of traffic. A rare ache settled in his chest, a mixture of guilt and longing. The empire he had built felt suddenly hollow, the boy's words serving as a reminder of a debt he had never repaid. For the first time in years, Victor found himself questioning what it was all for. That evening, the city was awash in soft amber light as snow began to fall, dusting the streets in a shimmering white layer. Victor found himself back in the lobby of the Altmore Plaza, standing near the grand Christmas tree. He had no meetings scheduled, no pressing deadlines that couldn't wait until morning. Yet here he was, scanning the faces of the crowd with a sharp, focused determination that had nothing to do with business. The boy's words had been gnawing at him all day, and despite his logical side insisting it was a waste of time, he couldn't shake the need to understand. Who was that boy? Why had he mentioned Joe Evans? And why now, after all these years, was Victor so deeply unsettled by it? The lobby was as lively as ever, filled with families admiring the decorations and hotel guests chatting by the fireplace. Victor's eyes darted from group to group, searching for a familiar face. Just as he began to wonder if his impulsive return had been foolish, he spotted him. The boy was standing near the Christmas tree, his sandy blonde hair catching the warm glow of the lights. Beside him stood a woman who looked to be in her early 30s. Her coat was simple but neat, and her features bore a quiet grace. Her dark hair was pulled back into a loose bun, and her eyes, bright and steady, were fixed on her son, who seemed to be explaining something animatedly. Victor hesitated. Approaching strangers, especially under these circumstances, wasn't something he did. He was a man accustomed to calculated moves, not impromptu interactions. Yet, he found himself walking toward them, the boy's voice ringing in his memory. "Excuse me," Victor said as he reached them, his tone polite but firm. The boy turned first, his face lighting up with recognition. "It's you!" he exclaimed, tugging on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, this is the man I was talking about." The woman looked at Victor, her expression a mix of curiosity and caution. "Good evening," she said, her voice soft but confident. "Is there something we can help you with?" Victor cleared his throat, feeling strangely out of place. "Your son mentioned someone earlier, Joe Evans," he began, his voice steady. "I knew a man by that name a long time ago. I'd like to know more about what he said." The woman exchanged a glance with her son, who nodded eagerly. "I told you, Mom. Grandpa always talked about him," She smiled faintly, her features softening. "I'm Anna Evans," she said, extending a hand. "Joe Evans was my father, and this is Lucas, my son." Victor shook her hand, his grip firm but brief. "Victor Carlisle," he said simply. "Your father? He ran a cafe, didn't he?" Anna nodded, her expression turning wistful. "Yes, for most of his life. It was his pride and joy, Joe's Corner Cafe. He loved that place. And he talked about you often, Mr. Carlisle. He always said you were someone special." Victor felt a pang in his chest, the weight of her words catching him off guard. "I'd like to see this photo Lucas mentioned," he said after a moment. "If it's not too much trouble." Anna hesitated, studying him carefully before nodding. "We live just a few blocks from here. If you don't mind a short walk, you're welcome to join us." Victor glanced outside, where snowflakes swirled gently in the night air. He nodded. "Lead the way." Anna and Lucas led Victor through the quiet streets, the snowfall muffling the usual city noise. The walk was brief, but felt longer, weighed down by the significance of what might await him. As they reached a modest apartment building, Victor noted its simplicity, a stark contrast to the luxury he was accustomed to. Yet there was a warmth to the place, a sense of belonging that stirred something deep within him. The apartment itself was small but cozy, filled with the kind of personal touches that made it a home. Framed photographs adorned the walls, and the scent of cinnamon lingered in the air, likely from a candle burning on the kitchen counter. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with homemade ornaments that Lucas had clearly contributed to. "Have a seat," Anna offered, gesturing to the sofa. Victor complied, his gaze wandering around the room. Lucas disappeared into another room and returned moments later, clutching an old photo album. He climbed onto the sofa beside Victor and placed the album on the coffee table, his small hands carefully flipping through the pages. "Here," Lucas said, pointing to a faded photograph. Victor leaned closer, his breath catching as he took in the image. It was a black and white photo of a younger version of himself, barely in his 20s, standing beside an older man with a wide, welcoming grin. They were in the cafe, its familiar wooden counter visible in the background. Victor recognized himself immediately. The boy in the photograph was thin, almost gaunt, but his smile was genuine, his eyes filled with a spark he barely remembered. "That's Grandpa," Lucas said proudly, pointing to the man beside Victor. "And that's you!" Victor swallowed hard, a rush of memories flooding back. Joe Evans, the man who had given him a job when he had nothing. The man who had believed in him when no one else did. The man whose kindness had been a lifeline during one of the darkest times in his life. Anna watched him carefully, her expression gentle. "My father always spoke of you fondly," she said softly. "He said you were the hardest worker he'd ever met. He called you the kid with a fire in his heart." Victor couldn't speak. His throat felt tight, and for the first time in years, he was overwhelmed by a wave of emotions he couldn't suppress. Gratitude, regret, and an ache for a time he had tried so hard to forget. "He never stopped talking about you," Anna continued. "Even when the cafe closed, he'd tell us stories about the young man who turned his life around." Victor finally found his voice, though it was quieter than usual. "I should have stayed in touch," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the photograph. "Joe, your father, he saved me." Anna smiled faintly. "He always believed in you, and I think he'd be happy to know you're here now." Victor nodded, unable to tear his eyes away from the image. It wasn't just a photograph. It was a reminder of everything Joe had given him. And for the first time in years, Victor felt the stirrings of something he thought he had lost, a desire to make things right. Victor left the Evans apartment under the soft hush of snowfall, his mind a whirlwind of emotions he hadn't felt in years. The photograph stayed etched in his thoughts, the younger version of himself, smiling, carefree, standing beside Joe Evans, a man who had given him so much without expecting anything in return. Now, years later, he realized how little he had given back. The snow crunched underfoot as Victor walked aimlessly through the streets, the cold biting at his cheeks. He didn't notice the grand displays of Christmas lights in the shop windows or the laughter of families passing by. His thoughts were consumed by guilt. How had he forgotten Joe? How had he allowed someone who had once been a lifeline to fade into obscurity as he climbed the ladder of success? Victor remembered vividly the first time he had walked into Joe's cafe. He'd been a desperate young man, penniless, hungry, and on the verge of giving up entirely. Joe had been behind the counter, wiping down the surface with a practiced hand, his warm smile cutting through the bleakness that had enveloped Victor's world. "What brings you in, kid?" Joe had asked, his tone kind but firm. Victor had stumbled over his words, mumbling something about needing a job. Joe had looked him over, not with judgment, but with genuine curiosity. And then, without hesitation, he had given Victor a chance, a job as a dishwasher, a hot meal, and a place to belong. That simple act of kindness had changed everything. But Victor had moved on, driven by his ambition to leave his old life behind. He hadn't looked back, hadn't considered the impact his absence might have had on Joe. Now, standing alone in the snow, he felt the weight of that neglect pressing down on him like a heavy stone. He stopped in his tracks, looking up at the dark sky as snowflakes fell gently around him. The air was crisp and still, yet his thoughts were anything but. Joe had believed in him, given him a foundation upon which he'd built an empire. And what had Victor done with that opportunity? He had taken it, run with it, and forgotten the man who had made it all possible. The boy, Lucas, and his excitement about the cafe lingered in Victor's mind. It was as if Joe's grandson could see the connection between them, a bond that Victor had neglected, but Lucas instinctively understood. "I owe him more than this," Victor murmured to himself, his breath visible in the frosty air. The next morning, Victor sat in his sprawling office overlooking the city, the skyline obscured by the snowfall that hadn't let up overnight. Yet the usual sense of satisfaction he felt from his success was absent. Instead, his thoughts were singularly focused on one thing: Joe's Corner Cafe. "Lila," he called, pressing the intercom on his desk. "Yes, Mr. Carlisle?" His assistant's voice answered promptly. "Cancel my meetings for the day, and I need you to find something for me." There was a brief pause. Lila was used to unusual requests, but Victor's tone carried a weight she rarely heard. "Of course, sir. What do you need?" "Joe's Corner Cafe," Victor said, leaning back in his chair. "It closed down years ago, but I need to know where it was, who owns the property now, and the state it's in." "I'll get right on it," Lila replied without missing a beat. Hours passed as Victor pored over old files, trying to distract himself. But nothing held his focus. His mind kept returning to the cafe, to Joe, to the photograph. By late afternoon, Lila entered his office, a folder in hand. "I found it," she said, placing the folder on his desk. Victor opened it with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Inside were photos of the abandoned cafe, its once vibrant facade now faded and boarded up. The sign that had proudly displayed Joe's Corner Cafe was barely legible, the letters chipped and weathered. "It's been vacant for over a decade," Lila explained. "The property's in bad shape, but it's still there. The current owner seems willing to sell if you're interested." Victor stared at the images, a strange mix of sadness and determination rising within him. The cafe looked nothing like he remembered, but he could still see its bones, the warmth, the sense of community it had once fostered. "I want it," Victor said firmly, closing the folder. Lila hesitated, studying him carefully. "Are you sure?" "It's going to take a lot of work to restore it." Victor nodded, his jaw set. "I've spent years building skyscrapers and tech empires. It's time I built something meaningful." That evening, Victor stood in front of the cafe for the first time in decades. Snow swirled around him, but he barely felt the cold. The building was a shell of its former self, but in his mind's eye, he could see it as it once was, alive with the hum of conversation, the clinking of coffee cups, and Joe's laughter ringing out from behind the counter. "This is where it all began," Victor whispered to himself. As he walked closer, his hand brushed against the faded sign, the rough texture a stark reminder of how much time had passed. But he wasn't going to let Joe's legacy fade into obscurity. He would bring the cafe back to life, not just for Joe, but for the community it had once served, and for himself. For the first time in years, Victor felt something beyond ambition driving him. This wasn't about profit or prestige. It was about gratitude, redemption, and honoring the man who had seen potential in a struggling young boy. And in that moment, Victor vowed to do whatever it took to make it happen. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Victor, with a determination he hadn't known he possessed, threw himself into the restoration of Joe's Corner Cafe. He worked closely with architects, contractors, and designers, ensuring every detail captured the essence of what the cafe had once been, while incorporating modern touches to bring it into the present. But beyond the design work, it was the personal connections he was making that filled him with a new sense of purpose. Lucas and Anna were there nearly every day, eagerly offering help and sharing stories about Joe. Lucas's enthusiasm was infectious, his small hands always finding something to do. Whether it was sweeping the floors, organizing supplies, or just hanging around the construction crew, Lucas was like a little ball of energy, constantly asking questions and learning. Victor found himself looking forward to his visits to the cafe, not just for the progress being made, but for the time he spent with Lucas and Anna. With every conversation, he learned more about Joe, the man who had been more than just a mentor to him, but a father figure when he had none. Anna often shared stories of her father's kindness, his tireless work ethic, and his quiet wisdom. Joe had always put others first, and his cafe had been a sanctuary for anyone who needed it. During lunch breaks, Victor and Anna would sit together, discussing everything from their pasts to their dreams for the future. He found himself opening up to her in a way he hadn't done in years, sharing parts of his life he had long kept buried. Anna listened attentively, offering words of understanding and encouragement. One afternoon, as the renovations were nearing completion, Victor stood in the cafe, taking in the sight of the progress. The walls were freshly painted, the countertops polished, and the furniture had been carefully chosen to reflect the warmth of Joe's vision. It looked like a place that could once again become the heart of the community. Lucas ran up to him, his eyes bright. "Mr. Carlisle, it looks just like the pictures Grandpa used to show me," he exclaimed, his voice full of excitement. "Do you think Grandpa would be proud?" Victor bent down to Lucas's level, smiling softly. "I think he would be more than proud. He'd be thrilled to see you here, helping to bring his dream back to life." Lucas beamed, his face lighting up. "I can't wait to show Mom." Victor watched him run off, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and sadness. He hadn't just restored a cafe, he had rekindled a bond that had been lost for far too long. And in the process, he had discovered a new family, one that wasn't bound by blood, but by shared history and values. As Anna joined him, she took a moment to admire the work. "It's incredible," she said, her voice full of emotion. "You've done more than I could have ever imagined, Victor. I know Dad would have been so happy to see this." Victor's eyes softened as he looked at her. "I did it because he believed in me. He gave me a chance when I didn't deserve one. And I've spent so many years forgetting that, taking it for granted." Anna smiled, placing a hand on his arm. "I think your actions now speak louder than anything you could have said. You've restored not just a building, but the heart of this community." Victor nodded, his gaze lingering on the newly renovated cafe. For the first time in years, he felt truly content. This wasn't just a project, it was a way to make amends for the past and honor a man who had given him everything when he had nothing. The grand reopening of Joe's Haven, as Victor had decided to name the cafe in honor of Joe, was scheduled for Christmas Eve. The atmosphere in the neighborhood was filled with anticipation. Word had spread quickly about the cafe's revival, and people were eager to see the transformation. The streets around the cafe were bustling with activity, as residents prepared to welcome the cafe back into their lives. Victor stood at the entrance of the cafe, his heart racing with a mixture of nerves and excitement. The doors had just been opened, and the first wave of customers was beginning to trickle in. He watched as people walked in, their eyes widening in delight as they took in the warmth of the space, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, and the familiar sight of the wooden counters that had once been the heart of the cafe. Inside, the cafe was everything Joe had envisioned and more. The rustic charm of the original design had been preserved, but the modern touches, like sleek lighting and cozy seating arrangements, gave the space a contemporary feel. A wall near the entrance had been dedicated to Joe's memory, with framed photos of him and his cafe, along with stories from those whose lives he had touched. Lucas ran up to Victor, his eyes shining with excitement. "Look, Mr. Carlisle, it's just like Grandpa's cafe." Victor smiled warmly, ruffling the boy's hair. "It's your grandfather's cafe, Lucas. Always will be." The grand opening was a success beyond anyone's expectations. The cafe filled quickly with familiar faces, people from the neighborhood who had once frequented Joe's Corner Cafe, along with newcomers eager to experience the renewed space. Laughter and conversation filled the air, and the clink of coffee cups echoed in the cozy space. As Victor stood behind the counter, serving coffee to a steady stream of customers, he couldn't help but feel a profound sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just about restoring a cafe, it was about restoring a sense of belonging, a place where people could gather, connect, and find comfort in each other's company. The evening wore on, and the cafe became a warm haven amidst the winter chill. Anna sat with him for a moment, her eyes filled with tears as she took in the scene. "I never thought I'd see this again," she said, her voice full of emotion. "Dad would be so proud of you, Victor. You've done something incredible here." Victor placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice low but full of gratitude. "It's not just me, it's all of us. Joe's legacy isn't just in the cafe, it's in the people who loved him, who will keep his spirit alive." As the evening drew to a close, Victor walked to the small corner of the cafe where a framed photograph of Joe hung proudly on the wall. He stood before it for a moment, silently paying his respects. The cafe wasn't just a place, it was a testament to the power of kindness, of second chances, and of community. Joe's legacy had been restored, and in doing so, Victor had found something he hadn't realized he was searching for: a sense of purpose, a connection, and a family he had never known he needed. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a quiet, peaceful silence. And inside Joe's haven, the warmth of shared memories and new beginnings filled the air, a fitting tribute to the man who had made it all possible. The reopening of Joe's haven quickly became the heart of the neighborhood. On that snowy Christmas Eve, the cafe had not only revived the spirit of Joe Evans, but had also reignited a sense of community that had long been lost. As the days passed, more and more locals came through the doors, each one bringing their own stories of Joe, stories of kindness, of laughter, and of the sense of belonging he had created within the walls of his humble cafe. It wasn't just about coffee and pastries, it was about people. Victor watched in awe as the neighborhood slowly rediscovered what it meant to come together. Old friends reconnected, former regulars exchanged fond memories of Joe, and new customers began to make their own traditions. The cafe was no longer just a place for coffee. It had become a gathering spot, a sanctuary for anyone who needed a place to call their own. One afternoon, Victor sat at a table by the window, watching as a group of elderly women shared a pot of tea. Their laughter filled the room, and for a moment, Victor was reminded of the conversations he'd overheard as a young man at the old cafe. He had forgotten how much the simple act of gathering with others could mean. He hadn't known how much he needed this. A reminder of the importance of human connection. In the rush of building his empire, he had distanced himself from those moments. But here, in Joe's haven, he was finding a sense of belonging he had never fully realized he was missing. Anna joined him at the table, her eyes scanning the cafe as she spoke. "It's incredible," she said softly, a tear escaping her eye as she glanced around. "Look at all of them, Victor. They're here because of Dad. He brought them together, and now you're continuing that." Victor nodded, his gaze settling on a young mother holding her infant son, a group of teenagers laughing over coffee, and the elderly women still chatting happily. "It's not just me, it's all of us. We've all brought something back to life here." Anna smiled, her voice tinged with gratitude. "I know, but you gave us the chance to do it." Lucas ran up to them, tugging at Victor's sleeve. "Mr. Carlisle, I want to show you something." His excitement was palpable as he pulled Victor toward the back of the cafe. Victor followed Lucas through the bustling space and into the small courtyard out back, where a garden had begun to take shape. There, beside the raised beds and potted plants, was a plaque, simple but profound, embedded in the ground. "Look, Grandpa would love this," Lucas said, his voice filled with pride. "I put it here so everyone who comes can see it." Victor bent down, his eyes scanning the plaque. It read, "Joe's Haven, a place where kindness is brewed with every cup." Victor felt a lump form in his throat. The words spoke volumes. It wasn't just about a cafe. It was about everything Joe had stood for. The kindness that had poured out of him into every customer, every conversation, and every cup of coffee. That legacy, once thought lost, had been revived in a way no one could have imagined. As he looked at Lucas, his heart swelled with gratitude. "Your grandfather would be so proud of you, Lucas." The boy's smile was bright and wide. "I know he would be, and now people can remember him every time they come here." Victor stood up, his hand on Lucas's shoulder. "This cafe, this whole place, is a legacy to him, and now it's ours to carry forward." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur, with customers coming and going, and the cafe filled with life. The holiday season was in full swing, and the atmosphere was electric with joy. Victor, for the first time in a long time, felt truly at peace. As the evening sun began to dip behind the snow-covered streets, he looked around the cafe one last time. This wasn't just a cafe anymore. It was a symbol of everything he had learned, everything he had gained, and everything he had lost. And in this moment, he realized that he had found something far more precious than wealth or power. He had found community. He had found love. And in a way, he had found a family. The weeks that followed the grand reopening were filled with laughter, shared meals, and the unmistakable hum of a cafe that had become more than just a business. It had become a place of refuge, a gathering spot, and a source of comfort. Victor continued to spend time at Joe's Haven, not just overseeing the cafe's operations, but taking a genuine interest in the people who walked through its doors. Every day there was something new to learn about the community. Victor found himself striking up conversations with the regulars, many of whom had once known Joe, and each person had a unique story to share. There was Mrs. Calloway, the retired schoolteacher, who would sit by the window and sketch the view outside while sipping her afternoon tea. There was Henry, a mechanic who had worked across the street for decades, now making the cafe his regular lunch spot. And then there was Clara, a local artist who had recently moved into the neighborhood and found solace in the warm atmosphere of the cafe. With each new encounter, Victor felt a deeper connection to the space, to the people who called it their own, and to the man who had made it all possible, Joe Evans. It wasn't just the cafe that had changed Victor. It was the community, the way the people shared their lives with him, trusted him, and welcomed him into their fold. As Victor sat at the counter one evening, serving coffee to an elderly couple, he saw Lucas sitting at a nearby table with his mother, Anna. Lucas looked up at Victor, his face lighting up with a smile. "Mr. Carlisle, Mom says you're part of our family now." Victor paused, the weight of the words hitting him like a wave. "Do you think so?" he asked gently, unsure if he deserved such a place in their lives. Lucas nodded enthusiastically. "I know so. You helped make Grandpa's dream real again. And now, we're all here because of you." Anna walked over to join them, her face radiating pride. "You've done more than anyone could have expected, Victor. You've built something lasting, something that will always be here, long after we're gone. Joe would have been proud to see this." Victor looked at both of them, the realization settling deep within him. He had found something he had been searching for his whole life. Not wealth, not recognition, but the kind of bonds that held people together through thick and thin. He had built an empire, yes, but in doing so, he had also found something more enduring, something that money could never buy. This was home. As the cafe buzzed with life around him, Victor knew that, for the first time in years, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The walls of Joe's Haven had given him something he had never fully appreciated before: connection, belonging, and a place to call home. And in that moment, he understood that he wasn't just restoring a cafe. He was restoring the essence of what it meant to be human, to care for others, to offer kindness, and to find joy in the simplest moments. Joe had taught him that. And now, it was his turn to pass that lesson on, not just to Lucas and Anna, but to everyone who walked through the doors of Joe's Haven. It was a crisp, quiet evening, just after the holiday rush had subsided. The last customers had trickled out of Joe's Haven, leaving behind only the soft hum of music and the scent of freshly brewed coffee hanging in the air. The soft glow of the overhead lights illuminated the cozy cafe, casting long shadows on the worn wooden floors. Outside, the snow continued to fall, dusting the world in a peaceful white. Victor sat at a corner table, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of hot cocoa, watching the gentle snowfall through the window. He could hear the sound of Anna and Lucas chatting softly from across the room, their voices warm and full of laughter. The laughter was familiar now, comforting, like the very air he breathed. It had become the soundtrack to his life in the months since the cafe's reopening, and somehow it had become his own. As he sat there, the weight of everything he had gained and everything he had lost settled heavily on his shoulders. He had come to this place, Joe's Haven, seeking redemption, perhaps even a way to mend the broken parts of himself that had been left behind in the wake of his success. But what he hadn't expected was to find something deeper, something far more important than anything he could have ever imagined. A family. Anna had been the first to show him that he wasn't alone. At first, he had resisted the idea of getting too close, of allowing his walls to come down. But Anna's kindness and understanding had drawn him in. She didn't ask for anything in return. She simply accepted him, flaws and all. She reminded him of what it meant to be human again, to live for something other than power or success. And then there was Lucas, the bright-eyed boy, with his endless enthusiasm and unshakable faith in people. Lucas had reminded him of the innocence of childhood, the belief that kindness would always find its way into the world. The way he had looked at Victor from the very beginning, with admiration and trust, had chipped away at the layers of cynicism Victor had built up over the years. He had become a part of their family, not just because of the cafe, but because they had let him in, accepted him for who he was, not for what he had accomplished or what he could offer. They had shown him what it truly meant to be connected to others. Victor's heart swelled with emotion as he watched Anna and Lucas from across the room. They were more than just the people who had been in his life for the past few months. They were now his family. In them, he had found the connection he had spent years searching for, but never knew how to reach. They had become his home in every sense of the word. Anna caught his gaze and smiled softly, walking over to his table with Lucas in tow. "You've been quiet tonight," she said gently, her eyes full of understanding. "Something on your mind?" Victor looked at her, the words he had been holding back finally spilling out. "I've never really known what it was like to be part of a family," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "But now I do, and it's because of you both. You've shown me that family isn't just about blood, it's about the people who accept you, who care for you, who help you grow." Lucas, ever the innocent soul, chimed in with a grin. "You're part of our family now, Mr. Carlisle. You're not just a friend anymore." Victor smiled, his heart lifting at the simple truth in Lucas's words. He reached across the table and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Thank you, Lucas. You have no idea how much that means to me." Anna's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she squeezed Victor's hand. "You've given us so much, Victor. This place, this cafe, it's not just a business anymore. It's a legacy, a home. We're so grateful to have you here with us." For the first time in a long time, Victor felt a deep sense of peace. In the middle of this small, bustling cafe, surrounded by the warmth of two people who had become as close as family, he realized that he had finally found what he had been looking for all along: love, connection, and a place where he truly belonged. As he sat there, basking in the warmth of the moment, the snow continued to fall softly outside. The world seemed to slow down, as if giving him a chance to savor this newfound sense of peace. Christmas morning arrived quietly, the city blanketed in snow, and the cafe adorned with festive decorations that sparkled under the soft light. The scent of cinnamon and cloves filled the air as Anna and Lucas worked together in the kitchen, preparing for the holiday breakfast rush. Victor stood in the center of the cafe, watching the familiar dance of activity around him. For the first time in years, he wasn't rushing, wasn't trying to meet some impossible deadline or outdo himself. Instead, he was here, in this place that had become his heart, surrounded by people he now called family. The cafe was bustling with life, customers coming and going, exchanging holiday greetings and laughter. It was a joyful noise, one that echoed through the space and filled Victor's heart with a quiet happiness. But it wasn't just the holiday cheer that made his heart swell. It was the realization that he had found something far greater than any material success could offer. Victor looked around at the people gathered in the cafe. The elderly couple who came every morning for tea, the young family who had just moved into the neighborhood, the group of teenagers who had taken over the back table for hours, laughing and sharing stories. Each of them had a place in this space, and each of them had contributed to something far more significant than just the reopening of a cafe. They had all become part of the tapestry that made Joe's Haven what it was. A place where people could gather, share their lives, and experience the simple joy of being together. As he stood there, lost in thought, Lucas ran up to him, holding something wrapped in a festive red bow. "Mr. Carlisle, I have a present for you," the boy said excitedly, holding out the small box. Victor smiled, kneeling down to accept the gift. "Thank you, Lucas," he said, his voice full of warmth. The wrapping came off quickly, revealing a simple framed photo. The picture was one of the cafe, Joe's Haven, filled with laughter and light. In the center, there was a plaque on the wall that read, "For Joe Evans, who taught us that kindness can change the world." Tears stung Victor's eyes as he stared at the image. It wasn't just a photo. It was a symbol of everything he had found in this place. Everything Joe had stood for, everything he had given, and everything he had now become. Anna came over and placed a hand on Victor's shoulder, her voice gentle. "Merry Christmas, Victor. We wanted you to have something that shows how much we appreciate you." Victor stood there, holding the photo, his heart full. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. "You've given me a gift that no amount of money could ever buy. You've given me a family, a place to call home." Lucas grinned up at him. "You don't have to thank us. We're family, remember?" Victor smiled, the weight of the past lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to truly belong. The snow outside continued to fall, soft and steady, and inside Joe's Haven, a sense of peace settled over everything. In that moment, Victor realized that Joe's Haven wasn't just a cafe. It was a symbol of everything he had been searching for, a place where kindness, love, and connection thrived. And as he looked around at the people who had come to mean so much to him, he knew that this was where he was meant to be. Joe's faith in him had come full circle. And in returning that faith, Victor had found something priceless, the gift of family. That day, as the last light of Christmas morning filtered through the windows of Joe's Haven, Victor felt as though he was standing at the beginning of a new chapter in his life. A chapter no longer defined by loneliness or endless ambition, but by connection, love, and a family he had never known. There he stood, surrounded by the laughter of Lucas, the gentle gaze of Anna, and the warmth of the space around him, as if the whole world had paused to allow him to feel the perfect peace he had been searching for. He knew that Joe Evans, the man who had given him a chance in the past, would always live in his heart, not just through the memories, but through the values Joe had instilled in him: kindness, humility, and a belief in the goodness of people. Today, those values had become a part of him, a part of the family he had unwittingly found. This Christmas was not just a time to reflect on his accomplishments and failures. It was the moment when he realized that the most precious things in life are not what you possess, but the people you love and the genuine connections you build. Joe's Haven was no longer just a cafe. It was a place where people came together to find comfort, belonging, and love. It had become a home, a place where no one was ever turned away, regardless of their past or future. Victor sat at the table, still holding the photo of Joe, his eyes distant, taking in the glowing lights around him. In his heart, a deep sense of peace washed over him. He knew that what he had today, his family, the love, and the connections, would be the force that carried him through whatever challenges lay ahead. And no matter where he went, he would always remember that it was kindness and faith in the simple, real things that led him to find where he truly belonged. And so, Victor Carlisle's story did not end at one point, but began a new journey, a journey he no longer had to walk alone. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story and for following Victor's journey of rediscovery, connection, and redemption. We truly appreciate your support and hope this tale has touched your heart as much as it has ours. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another heartfelt journey. Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. We love hearing from you. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to bring you more stories that inspire and connect us all. Thank you for being part of this adventure.